From the ashes of a medieval world forged in war and faith emerged a nation destined to change the map of the world, Spain. Its birth, orchestrated by the Catholic monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, was the first chapter of an epic of glory and unprecedented expansion. But beneath the shine of its crown, a web of intrigues, relentless decisions, and dark secrets was being woven. Was this union a divine pact or a masterstroke of political ambition? And at what cost was the greatest empire of its time built? By the end of the 15th century, the Iberian Peninsula was a geopolitical chessboard, fragmented into kingdoms with opposing ambitions. The Reconquista, a struggle lasting almost 800 years, had left a Christian identity forged in fire, but also scars that still oozed. The year 1492 not only witnessed the fall of the last Muslim stronghold in Granada, closing a historical chapter, but also opened the doors to an uncertain future. As the echo of victory resonated, a new shadow loomed over the peninsula, the Inquisition, promising an era of unity through religious fervor and absolute control. Isabella and Ferdinand, two monarchs whose vision would transcend their time, understood that only the union of their kingdoms could consolidate a power capable of dominating the board. Isabella, a queen of iron will who had fought for her throne in Castile, and Ferdinand, a diplomatic strategist from Aragon, sealed their fate with their marriage in 1469. This was not a simple marital alliance, it was a masterstroke on the power board, a fusion of forces designed to subdue their rivals and launch their nation toward an imperial destiny. The architects of this new power were not only the kings. Ambitious nobles and influential clerics maneuvered at court, securing their positions as royal authority was cemented. The creation of a professional army and a centralized tax system were the pillars upon which the modern state would be built. However, this quest for unity had a dark side. The establishment of the Inquisition in 1478 under the pretext of purifying the Catholic faith unleashed a systematic persecution against converts of Jewish and Muslim origin. The enigma that haunts us is whether the greatness of Spain demanded such a dark sacrifice, or if the ambition of its monarchs unleashed forces that would mark their legacy with an indelible stain. The consolidation of power culminated with their appointment as Catholic monarchs in 1479, a title that was both a declaration of intentions and a divine mandate. With the peninsula under their control, their ambition turned toward the ocean. In 1492, they financed the bold journey of a Genoese navigator, Christopher Columbus, in his quest for a new route to the Indies. The outcome of that expedition would exceed all expectations, the discovery of a new world, an entire continent brimming with riches and mysteries. This moment, born of a hunch and a miscalculation, became the cornerstone of the Spanish Empire, an empire that would extend to all corners of the globe. The consequences of this unification and expansion were immediate and transformative. The centralized state became a formidable machine of conquest and colonization, but the price of this growth was paid in blood and fear. The Inquisition intensified its reach, using persecution as a state tool. The decisions of Isabella and Ferdinand not only forged the destiny of Spain, but also established a model of imperial power that would blend glory with intolerance, an echo that would resonate through the centuries. The fundamental question of this initial chapter remains unanswered. What was the true balance of the creation of the Spanish Empire? Was greatness an inevitable result of sacrifice, or was the suffering of many the fuel that fed the ambition of a few? History offers us the pieces, but the puzzle of their motivations and consequences continues to fascinate us. In exploring the legacy of these first steps, it is vital to understand that each alliance, each battle and each decree laid the foundations of an era that redefined the boundaries of the known world. The union of Castile and Aragon was not just a local event, it was the big bang of a new universe. An era of global exploration that altered the course of humanity. And so, with ambition as their compass, the Catholic monarchs embarked on a journey into the unknown, dragging with them the lights and shadows of their time, toward a future that would be as bright as it was terrifying. Against the backdrop of this new world to be discovered, history leads us to the next chapter, the discovery of America, an event that would mark the beginning of Spanish overseas expansion and open a range of unprecedented possibilities and challenges. What secrets awaited in the unknown lands that Columbus would soon claim in the name of the crown? The adventure was just beginning. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. The unification of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon not only represented a change in the political map of the Iberian Peninsula, but also laid the foundations for a new era of exploration and conquest. In this environment, the yearning for an irresistible call resonated in the minds of the boldest men of the time. In 1492, the world as it was known was about to be transformed forever. The discovery of the New World would become one of the most significant and enigmatic feats in history, marking the beginning of Spanish overseas expansion and the quest for gold, glory, and faith. The monarchs Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, known as the Catholic monarchs, promoted a foreign policy that favored exploration. In a world where the competition for control of trade routes was fierce, the search for new lands became increasingly urgent. The whisper of stories about rich and unknown lands, as those that had reached the ears of Europeans through merchants and explorers, fueled the desire for adventure and profit. But who would be the bold one to dare challenge the limits of the known world? Christopher Columbus, a Genoese navigator with a vision that many considered excessive, emerged as the protagonist of this tale. After years of seeking sponsorship, he finally obtained the backing of the Catholic monarchs. With the promise of finding a new route to the Indies, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Nina. In his hands, he carried not only the hope of riches but also the mission to expand the Christian faith in still unexplored territories. The question of his true motivations remains open. Was he driven by the pursuit of personal glory or a deeply rooted religious fervor? On the 3rd of August in 1492, Columbus departed from the port of Palos de la Frontera. His journey across the Atlantic Ocean, a sea filled with legends and fears, was an exhausting experience laden with uncertainty. For weeks, the ship sailed under an unchanging sky, facing storms and the growing concern of their crew. The voyage was turning into an enigma, and the possibility of returning empty-handed loomed like a shadow over them. Finally, on the 12th of October in 1492, the fate of Columbus and his crew would change forever. On the morning of that day, they sighted land. They had arrived at what we now know as America, specifically to one of the islands of the Bahamas, which Columbus named San Salvador. The excitement among the crew was palpable. But the reality of what they had found was just beginning to unfold. Columbus, convinced that he had reached the Indies, could not imagine the implications of his discovery. What secrets and mysteries awaited in those unknown lands? The encounter with the indigenous peoples, the Tainos, was a crucial moment filled with meanings and misunderstandings. Columbus and his expedition encountered a rich and complex culture whose daily life revolved around agriculture and community. However, the understanding between the two worlds was limited. The indigenous people, astonished by the arrival of the Europeans, offered hospitality, while Columbus, in his quest for gold and riches, began to forge a relationship that would soon turn conflictual. The idea of conquest was beginning to take shape in his mind, a reflection of the ambition that had led so many explorers to ruin. The immediate consequences of this discovery were vast and multifaceted. Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, not only with tales of his journey but also with the promise of new territories and riches. The news of the discovery spread rapidly, generating a fervor that led to a wave of explorations and conquests. However, this fervor also signified the beginning of an era of exploitation and colonization that would forever transform the dynamics of global power. Could the suffering that would befall the indigenous peoples, caught in the whirlwind of imperialism, be foreseen? The enigma of the chapter looms over us. Was it truly a discovery, or rather an encounter that would trigger a chain of events with profound and, for many, devastating consequences? The story of Columbus and his arrival in America is undoubtedly a tale of adventure, but also a grim reminder of the consequences of unchecked ambition. As the news of his feat spread, new expeditions were preparing to follow in his wake, and thus the story of conquest began to take shape. As the shadow of conquest spread over the New World, another chapter of this vast history was preparing to unfold. The figure of Hernán Cortés emerged on the horizon, a man determined to overthrow the Aztec Empire and claim his share of the New World, where the echoes of Columbus still resonated. What mysteries awaited in Mexico? And how would they change the fate of the newly discovered land? The answer will be revealed in the next chapter, where the conquest of Mexico will serve as the backdrop for a story of ambition, betrayal, and power. The tension in the Caribbean would soon transform into a historical opportunity, a prelude to what was to come in the vast lands of the New World. Among the shadows of ancient civilizations, the Aztec Empire, with its capital in Tenochtitlan, stood as one of the most advanced cultures of its time. However, its splendor was about to be challenged by a bold man, Hernán Cortés, and a group of indigenous allies who, under the promise of a new order, would change the fate of a continent. The historical context surrounding the conquest of Mexico is a labyrinth of intrigues and tensions. In the early 16th century, the Aztec Empire, led by Emperor Moctezuma II, enjoyed unparalleled power in Mesoamerica. However, Aztec society was marked by a strict hierarchy and a tribute system that generated discontent among the subjugated indigenous tribes. The murmur of oppression resonated in the highland lands, while the Spanish Empire, for its part, was engaged in an insatiable quest for wealth and glory, driven by the ambition of its conquerors. In this context, the arrival of Cortés in 1519 would not be just another expedition. It would be the beginning of a conflict that would change history forever. Hernán Cortés, a nobleman from the province of Extremadura, had arrived on the island of Cuba in 1511 with the intention of making a fortune. However, his adventurous spirit and ambition led him to consider the possibility of exploring the continent. Upon hearing tales of the wealth of the Aztec Empire, his mind filled with visions of gold and glory. In 1519, with a small but determined group of men and the help of indigenous allies, particularly the Totonacs and later the Tlaxcalans, Cortés set sail for the heart of the Aztec Empire, defying the orders of his governor in Cuba. Cortés's decisions would be key in the unfolding of the events that followed. Upon reaching the coasts of Mexico, his cunning and relentless character led him to use diplomacy and force in equal measure. On his way to Tenochtitlan, he established alliances with tribes that opposed Aztec rule, promising to free them from the yoke of Moctezuma. The question of his motivations remains open. Was it the pursuit of wealth, personal glory, or was there a deeper desire to leave a mark on history? As he advanced toward the great city, Cortés's encounter with Moctezuma II was a crucial moment. The emperor, caught between the belief that the Spaniards were divine figures related to Quetzalcoatl and his desire to preserve his empire, chose to receive Cortés with honors. This encounter, laden with symbolism and misunderstandings, would lay the groundwork for the impending conflict. Cortés, with his rhetoric and audacity, managed to manipulate the situation to his advantage, using the fear and ambition of the indigenous peoples to fuel his own cause. The conquest of Tenochtitlan unfolded in a crescendo of violence and betrayal. Realizing the resistance he would face, Cortés made drastic decisions. In 1520, following the death of Moctezuma under unclear circumstances, some sources indicate he was killed by the Aztecs themselves, while others claim he fell victim to Cortés's manipulation. The wrath of the Mexicas was unleashed. The sad night, as the chaotic retreat of the Spaniards after a surprise attack would be known, marked a turning point in the contest. But could Cortés recover from such a defeat? His determination was unyielding. With the support of his indigenous allies and the cunning of his military strategies, he reorganized his forces and returned to the city. The siege of Tenochtitlan was a devastating episode. For months, the Spanish forces, along with their indigenous allies, fought against Aztec resistance. The war became increasingly brutal, employing tactics that included not only direct confrontations, but also the spread of diseases brought by Europeans, such as smallpox, which decimated the indigenous population. In August of 1521, following a prolonged siege and the destruction of the city, Tenochtitlan fell. Cortés, in an act that symbolized victory, claimed the city for the Spanish crown, marking the beginning of Spanish rule in the region. The immediate consequences of the conquest of Mexico were profound and lasting. The fall of the Aztec Empire signified the dissolution of its political and social structure, leaving a vacuum that would be quickly filled by Spanish colonial authorities. The encomienda system was established, where conquerors received land and indigenous labor in exchange for evangelization, a legacy that would transform Mesoamerican society forever. The wealth that flowed to Spain through the gold and silver from Mexican mines cemented the power of the Spanish Empire in Europe, but also sowed the seeds of oppression and suffering among indigenous peoples. However, the conquest of Mexico is not limited to the fall of an empire. In the backdrop of these decisions and actions, a troubling question arises. How much of this history is written by the victors, and how many truths have been buried under the weight of conquest? The voices of the indigenous peoples, their struggles and resistances, have largely been silenced in the official narrative. What secrets and alternative narratives might still exist in the shadows of the past? As we contemplate the legacy of Cortés and the conquest of Mexico, it is crucial to question the nature of the history we inherit. The narrative of Spanish triumph often overshadows the realities of indigenous resistance and the complexity of cultural encounters. The conquest was not simply an act of war, but a web of decisions, alliances, and betrayals that reconfigured the continent and left an indelible mark on history. Soon, the echo of the conquest would resonate even further, as other conquerors, such as Francisco Pizarro, prepared to follow Cortés's example in the heart of South America. The history of the Spanish Empire would extend like a mighty river, carrying with it the complexity of humanity and its quest for power and wealth, and leaving questions that still endure in the collective memory. The conquest of Peru loomed on the horizon, a new chapter in the epic of the Spanish Empire that was about to unfold. The news of this conquest would resonate throughout the continent, inspiring new and bold expeditions. The arrival of Francisco Pizarro in the lands of Peru in the 16th century is inscribed in a period of turbulence and change, where the echoes of imperial ambitions resonated in every corner of the New World. The vast Inca Empire, which stretched from the heights of the Andes to the rich coastal lands, found itself in a state of vulnerability, marked by internal struggles and the recent death of its emperor Huayna Capac. A power vacuum loomed over the region, an enigma that Pizarro and his small expedition were about to unravel. The historical context preceding Pizarro's arrival is complex. In Europe, the 16th century witnessed the rise of absolute monarchies and fervor for territorial expansion. Spain, after the union of the Catholic monarchs, found itself in a privileged position to undertake the conquest of new lands. The riches promised by the gold and silver of America were irresistible, and the influence of the Catholic Church propelled the evangelization of indigenous peoples. Meanwhile, in the heart of the Inca Empire, tensions were brewing that threatened to destabilize its vast rule. The death of Huayna Capac in 1527 had left an empire divided between two heirs, Huáscar and Atahualpa. This internal conflict would become a strategic opportunity for the Spanish conquerors. Francisco Pizarro, a man of modest origins, had been an adventurer and explorer seeking fortune in the New World. With fierce determination, he joined the expedition of Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who had crossed the Isthmus of Panama and glimpsed the Pacific Ocean. However, his ambition led him further. In 1531, with the support of only a handful of men, Pizarro embarked on a journey southward, determined to conquer the mysterious empire of which he had heard. But what secrets lay hidden in the lands he was about to tread? Pizarro's expedition reached the Peruvian coast in 1532, where he found a world of contrasts. The Inca civilization, with its impressive architecture and sophisticated social organization, was a reflection of a glorious past. However, political instability was palpable. Atahualpa, the victorious heir in the contest with his brother Huasca, was in Cajamarca, where Pizarro decided to execute his cunning plan. On the 16th of November in 1532, Pizarro and his men, armed with the advantage of gunpowder and cavalry, set an ambush in the square of Cajamarca. In an act of bold betrayal, they managed to capture Atahualpa, who had arrived confidently to negotiate. At that moment, the fate of the Inca Empire was sealed. Atahualpa, imprisoned, offered a fabulous ransom in gold and silver, a desperate attempt to regain his freedom. However, the greed of the Spanish conquerors seemed to know no bounds. As the Incas began to gather the promised treasure, the situation became critical. Tensions escalated, and in a grim turn of events, Atahualpa was executed on the 26th of July in 1533. The death of the emperor marked a turning point, not only for the Inca Empire but also for the history of America. The fall of this civilization, rich in culture and advancements, was a reflection of the shadows looming over the arrival of Spanish colonialism. The immediate consequences of the conquest were profound. The capture and subsequent execution of Atahualpa unleashed chaos in the Inca Empire. Pizarro's forces, as they ventured into the heart of Inca civilization, found not only riches but also fierce resistance. Indigenous tribes, which had previously been loyal to their emperor, became allies or enemies, depending on the circumstances. As the conquerors advanced, distrust spread like uncontrolled fire, leaving a legacy of division and suffering. The impact of the conquest was not limited to the military. The arrival of the Spanish also brought with it unknown diseases, which decimated the indigenous population. Unable to withstand the onslaught of smallpox and other plagues, the combination of violence, exploitation, and disease forever altered the social fabric of Peru, leaving a trail of death and desolation. What future awaited the peoples who once inhabited these fertile lands? Amid this context of chaos and transformation, an enigma emerges that endures in collective memory. The conquest of Peru was not merely a matter of power and greed. It also raises questions about the nature of the encounter between two worlds. Was the action of Pizarro and his men an act of military audacity or of calculated cruelty? To what extent has history glorified the conquerors while silencing the voices of the civilizations that were devastated? As we delve into the next chapter of this saga, we will explore how the decisions made during the conquest would lay the foundations for the encomienda system, which would radically transform the relationship between the colonizers and the indigenous peoples. In a world where power is measured in gold and blood, the repercussions of those acts would continue to resonate throughout history. What shadow will be cast over the next era of the Spanish Empire? Following the rapid military conquest, a power vacuum emerged that urgently needed to be filled. The necessity to organize the vast, newly acquired territory and to manage the relationship with its indigenous inhabitants became increasingly pressing. Thus, in the midst of a climate of expansion and ambition, the encomienda system was implemented, a strategy that promised not only the evangelization of the native peoples but also the exploitation of their labor to sustain the imposing colonial apparatus of the Spanish Empire. The 16th century, an era of discoveries and conquests, witnessed a politically and socially charged environment filled with tensions. The crowns of Castile and Aragon, merged under the Catholic monarchs, now found themselves at the helm of a vast empire that extended beyond the borders of Europe. The arrival of Columbus in America in 1492 had opened the doors to a new world, brimming with resources that promised to enrich the metropolis. However, this wealth came with a monumental challenge: the management of the diverse indigenous cultures inhabiting those lands. The conquerors, men like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro, had managed to subjugate entire empires through a mix of military strategy, alliances with local tribes, and in many cases the use of violence. But territorial control was not enough. The newcomers needed a system that would allow them to effectively administer the labor of the indigenous peoples, who, after being stripped of their social and political structures, found themselves trapped in a new order of servitude. In this context, the encomienda system emerged as a pragmatic solution. This model, which was officially established starting in 1503 in the Indies, granted conquerors and settlers the right to receive tribute and labor from the indigenous peoples in exchange for their protection and evangelization. The figure of the encomendero became the representation of colonial power, a man who, under the gaze of the crown, stood as responsible for the spiritual salvation of the natives. However, the question of the authenticity of this protection remains open. Was it real, or merely a veil that concealed exploitation? Key decisions regarding the implementation of this system were driven by the Spanish crown, which sought to balance economic development with the need for evangelization. The figure of Juan de Ovando, governor of Hispaniola, was crucial in the creation of this administrative framework. Ovando, like many of his contemporaries, firmly believed that the conversion of the indigenous peoples to Christianity was a divine duty. But this mission, so fervently defended, often translated into brutal control over the indigenous population, which was forced to work under inhumane conditions on plantations and in mines. As the encomienda system expanded, the reality became grim. In regions such as Mexico and Peru, where resources were abundant, the greed of the encomenderos led to systematic abuse. The indigenous peoples, stripped of their dignity and rights, were forced to work long hours, suffering from diseases and mistreatment. The indigenous population, which had previously thrived in their communities, began to decline drastically. How could an empire that considered itself a bearer of civilization and faith allow such devastation? The events surrounding the implementation of the encomienda system are filled with contradictions. While the encomenderos argued that their work contributed to the evangelization and benefit of the indigenous peoples, the reality was that many viewed the natives as mere economic instruments. Thus, the encomienda became synonymous with exploitation and suffering. Consequently, the system not only reconfigured the power relations between the settlers and the indigenous peoples, but also left an indelible mark on the social structure of the colonies. The immediate consequences of this system were profound. Indigenous resistance, although often crushed, began to take shape in various forms, from sporadic uprisings to the creation of alliances among tribes. Opposition to the encomienda slowly emerged. At the same time, discontent over oppression spread across the continent, creating a breeding ground for future conflicts. In the backdrop of this dark chapter of colonial history lies an unresolved enigma. To what extent was the encomienda system a necessary evil for the development of the empire, and how much of it was simply the greed of a few who played with the lives of thousands? As history progresses, the shadows of abuses and injustices persist, raising questions about the legacy left by this practice. The implementation of the encomienda system not only marked a milestone in the history of the Spanish Empire, but also laid the groundwork for a model of exploitation that would endure for centuries. As the echoes of colonization resonated in America, a new chapter in the imperial narrative was about to unfold. With the need to secure its trade routes and protect its vast empire, the eyes of the crown turned toward the ocean. Soon, the era of galleons would redefine the way Spain connected its domains, bringing with it both opportunities and new challenges. What mysteries await in the waters that cross the conquered lands? What riches and dangers lie hidden on the horizon? If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. That insatiable quest for wealth and power that had characterized the expansion of the Spanish Empire would soon find a solution to one of its greatest enigmas: how to ensure the safe transport of the treasures obtained in the New World. The creation of maritime routes connecting America with Spain would become an unavoidable priority for the Hispanic monarchy, in a world where the seas were both a pathway to prosperity and a terrain of dangers. The figure of the galleon emerged as a symbol of this era, uniting continents and cultures in a complex web of trade and conquest. In the context of the 16th century, the Spanish Empire was at the height of its power. However, this era of peak was not without challenges. The wealth coming from the American colonies, especially gold and silver, was the engine driving the economy of the peninsula, but its transport was fraught with risks. Pirates, privateers, and rival nations lurked in the waters of the Atlantic, turning every crossing into an odyssey. In this climate of uncertainty, the need to establish safe maritime routes became urgent. At the forefront of this endeavour was King Philip II, a monarch whose ambition was to equip his empire with a fleet capable of facing the dangers of the sea. In 1561, the system of fleets was instituted, organising the crossings into groups of galleons, creating a coordinated strategy aimed at minimising the risk of attacks. Under the supervision of the House of Trade in Seville, two main routes were established: the fleet of New Spain, which departed from Veracruz, and the fleet of Tierra Firma, which set sail from Panama. Each of these fleets was composed of a series of ships, all of the same class, the galleons. The galleons were large vessels, specifically designed for the transport of goods and treasures. Their elongated shape and cargo capacity provided them with advantages in both navigation and defence. These ships were armed with cannons and had an experienced crew, granting them the ability to confront the dangers of the ocean. Among the key figures in this story was Admiral Don Alvaro de Bazan, one of the most renowned sailors of the time, who contributed to the refinement of naval tactics that protected these crossings. The galleons were not only a means of transport, they were a reflection of an era in which ambition intersected with the need for security. In the 16th century, each journey became an epic filled with uncertainty. The crossing from the New World to Spain could last months, during which the vessels had to navigate storms, shortages of provisions, and above all, the lurking of enemies. English privateers such as Francis Drake became the main antagonists of these crossings, attacking and plundering the Spanish fleets on their way to the peninsula. The first great victory of the Spanish fleet occurred in 1565 when Philip II's armada managed to repel an attack by Drake near the Azores. However, the dangers did not cease and the need for innovation in the defence of the galleons became evident. In response to these challenges, the monarchy not only reinforced the navy, but also established diplomatic agreements to curb enemy incursions. But was this enough to guarantee the safety of the maritime routes? As the fleets of galleons crossed the ocean, the wealth they brought became a magnet for greed. The port cities of Seville and Cadiz became nerve centers of trade where gold and silver from the mines of Potosi and Zacatecas flooded European markets. However, this torrent of wealth also brought with it the shadow of corruption and greed. Local authorities, in their eagerness to obtain a share of the loot, began to engage in dishonest practices, creating an atmosphere of distrust and conflict. The impact of the arrival of the galleons was immediate and palpable in the peninsula. The Spanish economy, which had fluctuated between prosperity and crisis, found in these ships a new opportunity for flourishing. However, as wealth increased, so did the pressure on the less favoured classes, who saw how gold and silver did not always translate into benefits for the people. The question that arose was gold really the solution to Spain's problems, or, on the contrary, was it sowing the seeds of its future decline? Over time, the system of fleets and galleons consolidated, creating a maritime network that connected the Spanish Empire with the rest of the world. However, the story of these ships is not without enigmas. Despite their success in transporting wealth, the galleons also became symbols of the empire's vulnerability. The loss of a single ship could mean a devastating blow to the economy. In 1628, the fleet of ships that departed from Havana to Spain was attacked by the Dutch privateer Piet Hein, who captured the treasure of the fleet of 1628. an incident that reverberated in the courts of Europe, a reminder that security at sea was an illusion. Therefore, the Age of the Galleons is a chapter laden with mystery and contradiction. While Spain stood as a global power, its emblematic fleet sailed through treacherous waters, facing visible and invisible enemies. The intersection of wealth, ambition, and danger intertwined in every crossing, leaving a legacy that still invites us to reflect today. What secrets lie in the depths of the ocean? What lessons could we learn from an empire that, in its quest for greatness, sailed so close to the abyss? As we delve into the next stage of this story, we find ourselves at a turning point. The expansion towards Asia, driven by curiosity and the desire to trade with new lands, would become the next challenge for the Spanish Empire. The expedition of Magellan Elcano had left a trail of discoveries and promises. But could Spain truly capitalize on these opportunities in a sea of uncertainties? The history is just beginning to reveal its secrets as we sail towards the enigma of expansion in Asia. The expansion of the Spanish Empire was not limited to the vast lands of America. Its ambition for control extended towards new frontiers where mystery and adventure awaited. In this context, the figure of Ferdinand Magellan emerges as a central character, an explorer whose journey would not only unveil new trade routes but also challenge the conception of the world as it was known in his time. Magellan's determination, combined with the indomitable spirit of his crew, would lead them to cross unknown oceans, becoming the first to circumnavigate the planet. The 16th century, a period of intense European rivalries and desires for expansion, provided the perfect breeding ground for the emergence of bold explorers. As European crowns competed for control of new lands, Spain, under the reign of Charles I, glimpsed the possibility of opening a new front in Asia. The spices, gold, and other exotic resources that could be obtained were irresistible. However, the most direct route to the Spice Islands was controlled by rival powers, such as Portugal. This situation led to the search for alternatives, and thus the visionary mind of Magellan proposed a route to the west, challenging not only geographical boundaries but also deeply rooted beliefs about the world. Magellan's expedition, which set sail from the port of Seville in 1519, was an act of faith and defiance. With 5 ships and more than 200 men, the fleet faced storms, food shortages, and internal insurrection. In his journey, Magellan encountered betrayal and loyalty, hope and disillusionment. Each wave that struck the hull of their vessels seemed to whisper secrets of an unknown world, an echo of ancient legends that spoke of rich lands and hidden wonders. But who could have imagined that this journey would become a labyrinth of challenges? The year 1521 marked a decisive milestone when the expedition reached the islands we now know as the Philippines. Upon landing on the island of Cebu, Magellan established contact with the natives, who at first showed interest in the newcomers. However, history would soon reveal that glory and fatality often coexist in the same place. In an attempt to expand Spanish influence, Magellan became embroiled in local conflicts. His tragic death in the Battle of Mactan at the hands of the local warrior Lapu-Lapu was a grim reminder that power cannot always be imposed by force. The arrival of the Magellan Elcano expedition in the Philippines not only left a mark on the history of exploration, but also marked the beginning of a colonization process that would radically transform the lives of indigenous peoples. The Spanish presence in the islands was solidified with the arrival of the ship Victoria, the only one to successfully complete the circumnavigation of the world under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano. This triumph was not only a milestone for navigation but also sealed the fate of the Philippines, placing them under Spanish influence for more than 3 centuries. However, the question persists. Was the arrival of the Spanish in the Philippines an encounter of civilizations or an episode of colonization that brought suffering and resistance? The islands, rich in culture and traditions, became the stage for an encounter that still resonates in collective memory. Spanish influence would manifest in religion, language, and culture, but it would also leave deep scars that would take generations to heal. The echo of these questions is still felt today, where the legacy of colonization remains a topic of intense debate. The history of Spanish expansion in Asia, encapsulated in the journey of Magellan and Elcano, reveals a puzzle that invites reflection on the cost of progress and the pursuit of new frontiers. What secrets remain hidden in the waters they traversed? And how have these encounters shaped the identity of nations today? As the history of expansion in Asia unfolds, the next chapter delves into a broader context, the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, where the religious and political convictions of the time would weave a web of conflicts that would impact not only Europe but also its colonies in the New World. The shadow of religion would rise as a new protagonist, marking the fate of empires and civilizations. As the empire expanded abroad, a profound spiritual crisis was brewing in the heart of Europe, where the shadow of the Protestant Reformation began to spread like a disturbing echo in the consciences of the faithful. At the beginning of the 16th century, the continent was immersed in an atmosphere of religious and political tensions. The figure of Martin Luther, an Augustinian monk who in 1517 nailed his famous 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, unleashed a movement that questioned the authority of the Catholic Church and its practices, especially the sale of indulgences. This act of defiance resonated in the hearts of many who felt oppressed by the clerical yoke and desired a more personal relationship with the divine. Luther was not alone in his crusade. Other reformers such as John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli began to construct a new theological framework that proposed a more austere interpretation of the Christian faith. As reformist ideas spread, entire cities and regions in Germany, Switzerland and beyond began to adopt Protestantism, creating a deep fracture in the Christian unity of Europe. In this context, the Hispanic monarchy, under the reign of Charles I and later Philip II, found itself at a crossroads. How to respond to this growing challenge that threatened not only the Catholic faith but also the political stability of the empire that had taken so much effort to build? Charles I, who was also Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, felt called to defend the Catholic faith, not only out of personal devotion but also out of the necessity to maintain control in a diverse and multi-continental empire. From the throne of Spain, Charles summoned the Cortes and the Catholic leaders of Europe to discuss a unified strategy against the Protestant advance. This call to action reflected the urgency of the situation. The lands that had once been bastions of the Catholic faith were falling into the hands of what they considered heresies. In this climate of growing concern, the Hispanic monarchy began to adopt decisive measures. The period of the Counter-Reformation formally began with the Council of Trent, convened in 1545. This council, which extended over several sessions until 1563, became the beacon of the Catholic reaction against Protestant innovations. The Church not only reaffirmed its doctrines but also reformed practices considered corrupt. The creation of seminaries for the training of clergy, the prohibition of the sale of indulgences, and the promotion of religious education were just some of the immediate results of this effort. There, in the deliberations of Trent, a response was being crafted that sought to restore papal authority and discipline within the Church, an attempt to seal the cracks that the Reformation had opened. Philip II, the son of Charles I, would continue this work of defending Catholicism. With a determined character and a deep religious conviction, Philip established the Inquisition in the Spanish territories and its domains, an instrument intended to identify and punish heretics. The figure of the Inquisition became a symbol of the religious fervor of the time, but also an object of fear and mystery. How far were the monarchs willing to go in their struggle to maintain the faith? Executions and trials for heresy multiplied, and the echo of martyrdom resonated in the streets of cities like Seville and Toledo. The measures adopted by the Hispanic monarchy were not limited to the peninsula. In its vast territories in America, evangelization intensified with the arrival of new religious orders, such as the Jesuits and the Franciscans, who also took on the task of combating Protestant influence in the New World. Missions were established with renewed fervor, and Catholic doctrine became a tool for consolidating power. In this process, the Spanish Empire sought not only to expand its territory but also its faith. However, the Counter-Reformation was not a straightforward path free of conflicts. As efforts to reaffirm the Catholic faith intensified, tensions between Protestants and Catholics became increasingly violent. The religious wars that erupted in France and the Holy Roman Empire not only tore nations apart, but also led Philip II to become involved in armed conflicts. Expeditions to the Netherlands, where Protestant ideas had taken strong root, became a critical point in Spanish foreign policy. The struggles for political and religious control in this region not only drained the empire's resources but also posed challenges to Philip II's authority. The immediate impact of these events was palpable. The Hispanic monarchy consolidated itself as the bastion of Catholicism in Europe, but at a high cost. The persecution of heretics and the struggle against the Reformation led to a polarization of European society, where faith became a battlefield. The echo of religious violence would resonate for generations, leaving deep scars on the social fabric of nations. The question that emerged in this context was unsettling. Had the Catholic Church truly won its struggle, or was it sowing the seeds of discontent that would eventually blossom into new rebellions? As the shadow of the Counter-Reformation spread, the Spanish Empire faced the enigma of its own identity. Could it truly sustain a diverse and global empire under a single religious banner? The decisions made during this period of Catholic fervor would not only define the empire's destiny in the short term, but also leave a complex legacy that still resonates in contemporary history. The echo of the struggle for faith would not easily fade. Over time, the Hispanic monarchy would become embroiled in even more intense conflicts, such as the Battle of Lepanto, where the struggle was not only for faith but for the survival of the empire itself. The decisions made in the shadow of the Counter-Reformation, in an attempt to consolidate power and faith, would become a prelude to the battles that would define the future of Europe and the Hispanic monarchy itself. The answers to the questions that emerged during this time remain a mystery. Was the Counter-Reformation a definitive victory for Catholicism, or a strategy that masked an inherent fragility? History invites us to reflect on the decisions of those days as we prepare to delve into the next chapter, where the Battle of Lepanto will stand as one of the most decisive moments in the struggle for naval and religious supremacy in the Mediterranean. Could Spain consolidate its power in this new era of conflicts? Or would it face an uncertain fate in the sea of history? That crisis of faith would soon find its echo in the waters of the Mediterranean, where the fate of Europe would be played out in a naval conflict of epic proportions. The Battle of Lepanto, fought on the 7th of October in the year 1571, would not only mark a milestone in the history of naval warfare, but would also represent a confrontation between civilizations, a clash between Christendom and the Ottoman Empire. At a time when the waters of the Mediterranean were a stage of power and ambition, the Holy League, a coalition of Catholic powers led by Spain, was preparing to challenge Ottoman naval supremacy. The historical context preceding Lepanto is steeped in tensions. Since the fall of Constantinople in the year 1453, the Ottoman Empire had not only expanded its territories, but had also threatened the stability of Christian kingdoms in Europe. With the ambition of its Sultan, Selim II, and the formidable Ottoman fleet, the shadow of Ottoman control loomed over the Mediterranean. In this climate of growing unease, the Christian kingdoms of Europe began to understand that to confront this threat, they needed to unite. Thus was born the Holy League, an alliance formed by Spain, Venice, and Pope Pius V, with the aim of halting the Ottoman advance and restoring balance in the region. Among the protagonists of this dramatic story was Don Juan of Austria, half-brother of King Philip II, who would become the commander of the Christian fleet. Don Juan, a charismatic and bold leader, had been appointed to unify the various forces of the Holy League. By his side were other key figures, such as the Venetian admiral Francesco Morosini and the Spanish noble Álvaro de Bazan. Each of them would play a decisive role in the planning and execution of the battle. But the challenge was monumental. Could these disparate forces truly coordinate to face the formidable Ottoman fleet? The crucial decision that would seal the fate of the battle was the choice of time and place. The Christian fleet, composed of around 200 ships, gathered in the Bay of Lepanto in the Gulf of Corinth. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Armada, with approximately 300 vessels and more than 30,000 men, was ready, confident in its victory. The morning of the 7th of October dawned clear and serene, as if the very sky were expectant before the outcome of a conflict that promised to be monumental. The events of that day unfolded rapidly. As the signals of war sounded, the ships of both fleets positioned themselves in line. The artillery began to roar, resonating across the sea. The battle turned into chaos of cannon fire and shouts, a whirlwind of smoke and steel where each man fought not only for his life but for the future of his faith and his homeland. The bravery of the Christian soldiers faced fierce Ottoman resistance, which had been trained in the rigorous tactics of naval combat. However, the leadership of Don Juan of Austria began to make a difference. In a bold move, he decided to attack the center of the Ottoman formation, where confusion reigned. The key moments of the battle followed quickly. As the combat continued, the Christian fleet managed to break the Ottoman lines, and Admiral Ali Pasha, leader of the enemy fleet, was finally brought down. The result was devastating for the Ottomans, who suffered overwhelming losses. By the end of the day, the victory of the Holy League was clear and resounding. The battle not only signified the defeat of a fleet, but became a symbol of hope for Christendom and a turning point in the struggle against Ottoman expansion. However, the consequences of Lepanto were complex and multifaceted. While the victory provided a respite to the Christian powers, it did not halt Ottoman expansion in other regions nor guarantee lasting peace in the Mediterranean. Tensions between European powers continued, and the Holy League, although celebrated, did not manage to permanently unify the Christian kingdoms in their struggle against Islam. Was Lepanto truly a definitive triumph, or merely an illusion in an endless conflict? The enigma of Lepanto persists. What lessons can be drawn from this battle that resonated through the centuries? The struggle between faith and control, between unity and fragmentation, raises questions about the nature of power and resistance. History shows us that, although battles may be won, wars continue in the shadows and rivalries never completely extinguish. As the victory of Lepanto settled into the collective memory of Europe, a new challenge loomed on the horizon. The union of the crowns of Spain and Portugal under Philip II would change the balance of power on the continent and open another chapter in the history of the Spanish Empire, one that we will explore in the next chapter. The victory in the Mediterranean would soon give way to a new chapter in the history of the Iberian Peninsula. In the year 1580, an event that seemed to be the solution to internal struggles and territorial ambitions would unveil a complex web of power and legacy. The union of the crowns of Spain and Portugal under a single monarch, Philip II, emerged as an unexpected fact that plunged both kingdoms into an era of vast possibilities and latent tensions. The historical context preceding this union is a tale of intrigues and rivalries. Portugal, a nation that had forged its own maritime empire, found itself at a crossroads. Following the death of King Sebastian in the Battle of Alcázar Quibir in 1578, the country was plunged into a power vacuum. Without a direct heir, the hopes of the Portuguese to maintain their independence faded as Spanish interests lurked in the shadows. The Spanish Empire, which had already expanded its influence across America and parts of Europe, sought to consolidate its control and ensure the security of its trade routes. Philip II, son of Charles I of Spain and Isabel of Portugal, represented a blood link that could facilitate this union. However, his ascent to the Portuguese throne was not merely a bureaucratic matter. In the background, key decisions were being made that would define the future of both empires. Philip faced the dilemma of accepting the Portuguese throne while simultaneously maintaining the loyalty of the Portuguese nobles, who feared losing their privileges and autonomy. Philip's decision to claim the crown was motivated not only by personal interests but also by a political strategy aimed at stabilizing the region and strengthening Hispanic influence in the Atlantic. The proclamation of Philip II as King of Portugal was not a peaceful event. In 1580, the city of Lisbon became the stage for a conflict that would resonate throughout Europe. The Portuguese nobles, divided between those who supported Philip and those who opposed his rule, found themselves embroiled in an internal struggle that stirred the waters of the Atlantic. Tensions escalated, and although Philip managed to establish his authority, not without resistance, the shadow of a discontented Portugal loomed over his reign. Events unfolded rapidly. Through shrewd diplomatic and military maneuvers, Philip II sent troops to quell the uprisings and consolidate his authority. The battles and confrontations not only marked the resistance of the nobles but also revealed a deep resentment towards Spanish control. However, the union of the crowns, in its essence, promised an era of commercial and military expansion. The Spanish and Portuguese fleets would sail together, and although the idea of a unified Iberian Empire seemed bright, the reality was much more complex. The immediate consequences of this union were palpable. In the economic realm, the riches of the Portuguese colonies began to flow into the Spanish coffers, generating an increase in the opulence of the empire. Trade with Asia, especially with spices and silk, was consolidated under a single command, expanding the reach of Hispanic influence. However, this very flow of wealth awakened jealousy and ambitions in other European nations, creating a new landscape of competition and conflict. England, France and the Netherlands felt threatened by the consolidation of an Iberian empire, which would lead to future confrontations at sea. But was this union truly the solution to the problems of both kingdoms? History suggests that, although Philip II sought to unify and strengthen his control, internal resistance and the effects of his administration began to erode the loyalty of the Portuguese. The union of crowns, which promised a bright future, transformed into an enigma that raised questions about the identity and autonomy of Portugal. Could a single monarch truly represent the interests of two nations with such distinct cultures and traditions? In the following years, the lack of a policy that integrated the Portuguese into a system where Spanish interests were prioritized would begin to lay the groundwork for discontent that would culminate in the struggle for independence. The union, in its essence, was nothing more than a layer of gold over unstable ground, an emblem of power that concealed a backdrop of tensions and struggles for identity. Thus, the echo of these events resonates in history, leaving a mystery that endures. To what extent was the union of crowns a step towards greatness or a prelude to fragmentation? The shadow of this union would loom over future events, setting the stage for the Wars of Flanders and the conflict that loomed on the horizon. Could Philip II's ambition, in his quest for a unified empire, have sown the seeds of even greater discord? History invites us to reflect on the complexity of political decisions and their consequences as we move towards the next chapter of the Spanish legacy. The shadow of conflict loomed over the Netherlands, a territory divided by climates of religious fervor and aspirations for autonomy. This tension would soon ignite into a sea of flames where the flags of the Hispanic monarchy and the rebellious provinces would wave in a tug-of-war that would last for more than 8 decades. The Wars of Flanders would mark a crucial chapter in the history of an empire that stretched from the Americas to Asia, revealing not only the ambitions of a king but also the struggles for freedom and identity of a people. Historical context. By the end of the 16th century, the United Provinces of the Netherlands were in a state of upheaval. The hegemony of the Hispanic monarchy, under the reign of Philip II, felt like a heavy yoke upon these lands. The mix of the Protestant Reformation and the rigid Catholic policy imposed by the Crown had sparked the flame of rebellion. Social and economic tensions, fueled by high taxes and the repression of religious freedoms, provoked a cry of resistance that resonated in every corner of Flanders. The administration of Philip II, marked by his desire to maintain absolute control, unleashed a series of draconian measures that only served to fan the flames of discontent. The persecution of Protestants, public executions, and the Inquisition were tools in the hands of a monarch who saw himself as the defender of Catholicism. However, the echo of resistance began to resonate strongly, and the common people, alongside the discontented nobility, started to raise their voices in a clamour for freedom. Key figures and decisions. Among the figures who would play a crucial role in this conflict was the Duke of Alba, Fernando Álvarez de Toledo, a renowned military leader who arrived in the Netherlands in 1567 with the mission of quelling the rebellion. His arrival marked a point of no return. Appointed as governor, Alba implemented the Council of Tumults, a tribunal dedicated to harshly judging the rebels. The Duke's decisions, although effective in the short term, would become his own trap, as they provoked an increase in opposition and the unification of the provinces against Spanish power. On the other hand, figures like William of Orange emerged as leaders of the resistance. His ability to unite the diverse sectors of society, from the nobility to the working classes, granted him an almost mythical status. William was not only fighting for religious freedom but also for the political independence of his homeland. His famous phrase, "Freedom is the mother of all virtues," encapsulated the yearning of a people beginning to dream of a future without Spanish oppression. Development of events. The conflict erupted openly in 1568, initiating a brutal and prolonged war characterized by its complexity. Battles followed one after another, from the initial uprising known as the 80 Years' War to the sieges that would shape the course of the struggle. The rebels, often poorly equipped and disorganized, found in cunning and tactical ingenuity their best weapons. Victories in places like the Battle of Heiligerlee in 1568, although not decisive, injected new momentum into the fight. The war transformed into a scene of resistance not only militarily but also culturally and economically. The famous Union of Utrecht in 1579 united the northern provinces in a common cause, forming the basis of what would later become the Republic of the Netherlands. The strategic decisions of William of Orange began to bear fruit, and the support from England and France became a determining factor in the development of the conflict. The interventions of these European countries were decisive, as they not only provided resources but also legitimized the struggle for independence in the European context. However, the conflict was not without tragedies. The cities of Flanders became battlegrounds, and the civilian population suffered the consequences of a confrontation that seemed endless. Massacres, such as the sack of Antwerp in 1576, left deep scars in the collective memory. The brutality of the conflict became a symbol of the struggle for freedom, but also a reminder of the human cost it entailed. Immediate consequences. The outcome of the Wars of Flanders was not limited to the simple victory or defeat of one side. The impact of this prolonged conflict resonated throughout Europe, altering the balance of power on the continent. The independence of the United Provinces not only meant the loss of territory for the Hispanic monarchy, but also weakened its influence in European trade. The growing autonomy of the northern provinces fostered an economic boom that laid the foundations for what would become European capitalism. On the other hand, the conflict left a legacy of resentment and division. The open wounds between Catholics and Protestants were deep, and the echo of war would resonate in the generations to come. The struggle for freedom in the Netherlands became a beacon for other independence movements in Europe, and the figure of William of Orange emerged as a symbol of resistance and the quest for freedom, the enigma of the chapter. However, despite the victory of the United Provinces and the consolidation of their independence, a question persists. Was freedom truly achieved, or was it simply a change of oppressors? The shadow of the Hispanic monarchy continued to loom, and the enigma of true autonomy remained unresolved. What secrets still awaited in the depths of this conflict? And what consequences would it have for the future of Europe? The Wars of Flanders not only marked the fate of a people, but also opened a new chapter in the history of the Hispanic monarchy, which would soon face even greater challenges in the Atlantic Ocean. The failed naval expedition to invade England, a titanic project known as the Invincible Armada, loomed on the horizon, ready to demonstrate that the empire was built not only on conquests but also on failures that would leave indelible marks on its path toward modernity. That tension would soon manifest itself in more dramatic ways. As the tensions between England and Spain intensified, the shadow of war loomed over the Atlantic. In this turbulent context, Philip II, King of Spain, decided to launch an ambitious military operation that would change the course of history: the creation of the Great Armada, a vast naval effort aimed at invading England and restoring Catholicism on the island. But could this giant of steel and sails meet the expectations that its own creator had placed upon it? The 16th century was a period of intense political and religious rivalries in Europe. Spain, under the rule of Philip II, had reached the peak of its imperial power. However, its supremacy was threatened by the growing influence of England, led by Queen Elizabeth I. The tensions were fueled not only by political motives, but also by religious fervour. The Protestant Reformation had divided Europe, and in this context, the figure of Elizabeth stood as a symbol of Protestantism, challenging the authority of the Pope and Catholicism. The execution of Mary Stuart, Elizabeth's cousin and a fervent Catholic, was the final nail in the coffin of the relationship between the two nations. Philip II, seeking revenge and the restoration of the Catholic faith, saw the invasion of England as a paramount task. The decision to build a formidable armada was made in the year 1586, when Philip II ordered the creation of a fleet composed of more than 130 ships and nearly 30,000 men. Commanding this colossal enterprise was appointed one of the most experienced admirals of the time, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. However, the choice of the Duke also became a turning point. His declared lack of naval experience and his reluctance to accept the mission would become critical factors throughout the expedition. Meanwhile, Philip II was a king who clung to the idea of invincibility, convinced that his fleet, armed to the teeth with the latest technological advances of the time, would be unbeatable. With an unprecedented display of naval power, the Great Armada set sail from the port of Lisbon in May of 1588. The mission was clear: cross the English Channel and establish a foothold in England from where they could launch their final attack. But the sea, which had been an ally in so many conquests, would turn into the most formidable adversary. Storm clouds began to gather, not only in the sky, but also in the fate of the fleet. As the expedition progressed, the Armada encountered a series of unforeseen challenges. The tactics of the English Navy, led by admirals such as Francis Drake, were cunning and meticulous. With lighter and more maneuverable ships, the English employed a strategy of constant harassment, attacking unexpectedly and retreating before the Spanish Armada could respond. Drake's attack on the Spanish ships in the port of Cadiz became a symbol of English resistance and a harbinger of the impending disaster. In July of 1588, the Great Armada reached the English shores, but the wind, which had been an ally during the crossing, had changed. The currents of the North Sea turned adverse, and the fleet found itself trapped in a series of unfortunate encounters. The climactic battle was fought at Gravelines, where the lack of coordination and the inexperience of Medina Sidonia became evident. The Spanish fleet, massive but clumsy, was dismantled by the agility of the English ships, which attacked in waves, overwhelming their enemies. At the end of the conflict, what remained of the Armada was an echo of its initial ambition. Of the more than 130 ships, only 67 returned home. The defeat not only meant a military setback, it was also a devastating blow to the morale of an empire that had considered itself invincible. The shadow of failure loomed over the Spanish court, and the figure of Philip II, who had dreamed of glory, began to be seen in a different light. The defeat of the Great Armada marked the beginning of a slow but inexorable decline for the Spanish Empire, which was already beginning to feel the cracks in its vast dominion. The immediate consequences were palpable. The English victory not only reaffirmed Elizabeth I's position in Europe, but also strengthened the tide of Protestantism on the continent. European powers began to question the invulnerability of Spain, while other countries such as France and the Netherlands started to consider the possibility of challenging the Spanish crown. The echo of the defeat reverberated in the circles of power, fueling distrust and rivalry among nations. However, the enigma persists. Why could such a powerful empire with such vast resources fall into such a monumental disaster? The decisions of Philip II, the lack of experience of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, and the ingenious resistance of the English intertwine in a narrative that invites reflection. Was the Great Armada a symbol of imperial arrogance, or simply a victim of circumstances? What secrets and lessons does this dark chapter in the vast history of the Spanish Empire leave us? As the echo of defeat fades, the legacy of the Great Armada becomes a reminder that even the most powerful empires can be challenged. History, with its web of decisions and consequences, unfolds before us, and what seems to be an end is, in fact, a new beginning. Thus, as the shadows of the Great Armada dissipate, a bright and tumultuous future for culture and art in Spain looms, a rebirth that will lead us to explore the Golden Age, a period in which creativity would flourish despite adversities. That defeat would soon leave its mark on the vast territory of the Spanish Empire, but before the shadows of decline began to emerge, Spain found itself at the height of its splendor, a period that history would call the Golden Age. This time, which extended approximately from the late 15th century to the late 17th century, was a true cultural and artistic renaissance, an echo of greatness that would resonate through the centuries. The Iberian Peninsula became a melting pot of ideas, where art and literature flourished under the influence of a monarchy that, although facing multiple challenges, strove to consolidate its power in Europe and beyond. The historical context preceding this cultural flourishing is crucial for understanding the magnitude of its impact. As the Catholic monarchs Isabel and Fernando united their crowns, the unification of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon laid the foundations of an empire that would expand into the New World. However, this expansion not only brought wealth but also a torrent of ideas and an unprecedented contact with diverse cultures. The arrival of conquerors to American lands and the exchange of knowledge with the Muslim world, which still influenced the peninsula, fostered an environment conducive to artistic and literary creation. The figures that emerged in this context were not mere actors of an era, they were titans of thought and creativity. Miguel de Cervantes, with his monumental work Don Quixote de la Mancha, emerged as a beacon of literature, challenging the conventions of his time and offering a profound reflection on reality and fiction. Through its pages, the enigma of madness and sanity intertwined with the search for identity in a changing world. But who was Cervantes really? A man marked by adversity, a soldier and a prisoner who found in the pen his liberation and his legacy. In parallel, painting also reached new heights through figures such as Diego Velázquez. The Sevillian master, in the service of the court of Felipe IV, not only captured the essence of the Spanish aristocracy, but also explored the complexities of the human being in his portraits. The work Las Meninas is not just a representation of Infanta Margarita, but a visual enigma that invites the viewer to question the nature of reality and representation. What secrets lie behind that enigmatic gaze of the artist himself? Challenging the notion of perspective and space. The development of these cultural events was accompanied by key decisions from the monarchy and the elites. Felipe II, although often remembered for his religious devotion and his expansionist policy, was also a patron of art and literature. His court in Madrid became a vital center where intellectuals and artists gathered, creating an environment conducive to the exchange of ideas. However, this same court was marked by intrigues and power struggles, a reminder that greatness always carries a price. The immediate consequences of this cultural flourishing were palpable. Spain positioned itself as a cultural power in Europe, attracting the attention and admiration of neighboring nations. The influence of Cervantes and Velázquez transcended borders, establishing a legacy that endures to this day. Works of art and literature became symbols of national pride, while the Spanish language began to expand, carrying with it the echoes of an empire that, although at its peak, already showed signs of internal tension. However, despite this brilliance, the Golden Age is imbued with an enigma that invites reflection. How is it possible that an era of such splendor could simultaneously sow the seeds of its own decline? Social tensions, the pressure of war costs, and corruption in institutions began to loom like shadows on the horizon. The cultural and artistic splendor, although radiant, could not hide the winds of change that were already blowing strongly. Thus, the Golden Age, with its glories and its shadows, stands as a testament to human potential and the fragility of empires. This period, which shone brightly, leaves us with questions that challenge the perception of time. What other secrets lie hidden in the unwritten pages of history? Could a cultural renaissance be the prelude to an even greater crisis? The answers to these enigmas will begin to unfold in the next chapter, where we will delve into the crisis of the 17th century, a time when economic and political difficulties intertwined with the legacy of those who built the splendor. How would the last Habsburgs face the challenges of an empire that, despite its greatness, was beginning to wobble? History is far from over, it is just beginning to reveal its secrets. If you're enjoying the video, give it a like and subscribe to see more content from the channel. That cultural brilliance would soon reveal the shadows lurking over the Spanish Empire. During the 17th century, the splendor of the Habsburgs, which had shone brightly, began to fade, leaving an echo of economic, political, and social difficulties that would resonate throughout history. The empire, which had reached its peak in the previous century, now found itself on the brink of an abyss, facing a reality that challenged its greatness. The historical context of this period is marked by a complex web of conflicts and tensions. The ongoing war in the Netherlands, the pressure from emerging powers such as France, and the constant threat of the Ottoman Empire, all within a breeding ground of internal instability and social discontent. The population, exhausted by taxes and the demands of a state that seemed more concerned with its glory than with the welfare of its subjects, began to question the legitimacy of a government that could no longer sustain itself on the foundations of wealth obtained in the New World. The arrival of the last Habsburgs to the throne with Philip III, Philip IV and Charles II would mark a period of decline that laid bare the excesses and weaknesses of the empire. The key figures of this chapter are undoubtedly the monarchs who ruled during this time. Philip III, a king more interested in art and culture than in state affairs, left governance in the hands of his favourite, the Duke of Lerma, who prioritised his own interests over the health of the empire. This decision, although common at the time, led to a weakening of royal power and the corruption of institutions. Philip IV, who ascended to the throne in 1621, attempted to regain control but found himself ensnared in the web of a military conflict that drained the country's resources. In turn, the reign of Charles II, nicknamed the Bewitched, became a symbol of impotence and decline, characterized by his ineffectiveness and fragile health, which rendered him a mere spectator in the affairs of the empire. The decisions made by these monarchs were, in many cases, reactions to a crisis that had already erupted. Foreign policy became a game of survival. The 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 to 1648, broke out in Europe, dragging Spain into a conflict that, although initially seemed an opportunity to reaffirm its power, soon proved to be a burden. In 1625, the siege of Breda, led by the Count Duke of Olivares, became a fleeting victory that failed to conceal the ravages of war. The state coffers were emptying, and the gold and silver extracted from America began to lose their value, partly due to inflation and poor economic management. Internally, the situation was equally precarious. The administration of the empire was crumbling under the weight of bureaucracy and corruption. The revolts in Catalonia and Portugal, which cried out for greater autonomy and better treatment, revealed a popular discontent that spread like an oil stain, threatening to destabilize an empire that had until then shown itself to be unyielding. In 1640, Portugal rebelled and proclaimed its independence, a devastating blow to the Spanish crown that symbolized the loss of a legacy of centuries. The economic crisis was equally devastating. The dependence on the American colonies, which had been the source of wealth during the previous century, turned into a trap. The fleet system, designed to protect transatlantic trade, became an easy target for pirates and enemy fleets. The losses of ships and goods increased, and trade became uncertain. In turn, agriculture on the peninsula suffered, and with it, the economy was forced to rely increasingly on loans from foreign bankers, especially from the Genoese, leading to a state of chronic indebtedness. The events that unfolded during this crisis were multiple and complex, intertwining in a narrative of misfortune and despair. The decisions of the monarchs, although made with the intention of recovering lost glory, often resulted in more chaos. The inability to confront internal corruption and the lack of effective leadership created a vicious cycle that further weakened the structure of the empire. As the situation deteriorated, the shadow of war and social discontent loomed over the peninsula, leaving the nation in a state of uncertainty and fear. The immediate consequences of this crisis were profound. The loss of Portugal marked a turning point, and the empire, which had been a superpower, began to crumble before the eyes of Europe. The 30 Years' War, far from being a triumph, became a symbol of resource exhaustion and internal struggle for power. Defeats on the battlefield and the inability to maintain peace in the provinces translated into a weakening of royal authority, which in turn provoked an increase in social tensions. But beyond the figures and events, the true enigma of this chapter lies in the question that hovers over the legacy of the last Habsburgs. How could such a vast and powerful empire fall into such a deep and devastating crisis? Was it the inexorable fate of a monarchy that, trapped in its own magnificence, failed to adapt to the changes surrounding it? Or perhaps was it a series of wrong decisions, a chain of unfortunate events that, when combined, led the empire to its ruin? As we delve into the next chapter, where the Peace of Westphalia looms as a turning point in European history, it will be crucial to consider how the echoes of this crisis influenced the balance of power on the continent and how the Spanish Empire, in its moment of greatest fragility, was forced to redefine its place in a constantly changing world. That widespread crisis would find its resolution in an unexpected scenario. As the flames of the 30 Years' War consumed the heart of Europe, a conflict that spanned from 1618 to 1648, the continent was on the brink of collapse. A web of alliances and rivalries had transformed what began as a religious struggle between Catholics and Protestants into a true power play for European supremacy. In the midst of this storm, the Peace of Westphalia emerged not only as a treaty, but as a new order that would redefine the political map of Europe and the influence of the Spanish Empire. The historical context that preceded the signing of this treaty was one of chaos and devastation. Battles were fought on German lands where armies from various nations clashed relentlessly. The population suffered the consequences of an endless war. Hunger, plague, and destruction had become the norm. In this desolate scenario, the figure of Cardinal Richelieu, Prime Minister of France, rose as a key player. His policy of intervention in the conflict sought not only to weaken the Habsburgs, who controlled both the Spanish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, but also to establish France as the dominant power in Europe. But how would peace finally be forged in such a fractured continent? At the same time, on the Spanish side, the figure of Philip IV, King of Spain, found himself trapped in a game of complex decisions. As his country struggled to maintain its empire and prestige, the reality of a Spain in economic and military decline began to become evident. The war had drained the country's coffers, and the need to find an agreement that would end the suffering of its population became increasingly urgent. Diplomacy became the new battlefield. The key actors in this negotiation process were many, but three names stand out: the aforementioned Richelieu, the Spanish diplomat Count Duke of Olivares, and the papal nuncio who, in an attempt to mediate, sought a balance among the powers. The first conversations took place in 1641, but it was not until 1648 that a definitive agreement was reached. The signing of the Peace of Westphalia in October of that year became a monumental milestone. This treaty not only ended the war but also laid the foundations for a new international order, where the sovereignty of states was recognized and a new balance of power was established. The unfolding of events that led to this peace was equally fascinating. The negotiations took place in parallel in two German cities, Münster and Osnabrück. Each side brought with it its expectations, anxieties, and above all, its secrets. At the negotiation table, not only the terms of peace were discussed, but also territorial claims, religion, and the loyalty of the states. The extent of the war had weakened many, but it had also strengthened others. Sweden, for example, emerged as a new power, while the Spanish Empire began to lose its preeminence. The immediate consequences of the Peace of Westphalia were profound. The treaty not only ended a devastating war but also redefined the political map of Europe. Emerging powers such as France and Sweden acquired territories and recognition, while the Habsburg Empire, although still powerful, began to experience a slow erosion of its influence. Spain, for its part, although it still maintained vast domains, could no longer be considered the undisputed hegemon of Europe. This new balance in which states were recognized as independent sovereigns laid the groundwork for the modern international system. But what secrets still awaited in the depths of this treaty? The Peace of Westphalia was not only an end but a new beginning filled with enigmas. The question persists: was peace truly achieved, or were the conflicts merely postponed to erupt in the future? The shadow of war never completely dissipates, it always lurks, waiting for the opportune moment to resurface. The Peace of Westphalia, with its complexity and consequences, thus becomes a fundamental chapter in the history of Europe and the evolution of political power. From this treaty emerged not only new borders but also new rivalries that, like distant echoes, would resonate throughout the centuries. As Spain attempted to reconfigure its place in the world, the old continent was already preparing for a new dispute that would change the course of its history: the War of Spanish Succession. In this new conflict, the legacy of the Spanish Empire would once again be challenged, marking the beginning of an era of uncertainty and transformation. The new European order would soon transform into a conflict that would resonate throughout the continent. The death of Charles II in 1700, a monarch whose life was marked by weakness and instability, left a power vacuum that would plunge Europe into a puzzle of ambitions and rivalries. His passing, after a life filled with suffering and illness, not only generated mourning in the courts but also ignited the fuse of a war that would change the fate of nations. The political context of the time was complex and multifaceted. Spain, weakened by years of internal and external conflicts, found itself in a state of decline. The 30 Years' War had left deep scars on the economy and morale of the empire. In this landscape, the future of the Spanish throne became uncertain. The death without heirs of Charles II, the last of the Habsburg dynasty, created a void that different European powers rushed to fill. The king's will designated Philip of Anjou, grandson of King Louis XIV of France, as his successor. However, this decision would not only jeopardize the fate of Spain but also unleash a series of chain reactions that would lead to the War of Spanish Succession. Among the key figures who emerged from this tumultuous scenario was Philip of Anjou himself, who would become Philip V of Spain. Burdened by the legacy of Louis XIV, Philip ascended to the throne with the promise of restoring Spanish splendor. However, his rise would not be welcomed by all. The Habsburg dynasty, led by Emperor Leopold I, saw this union as a direct threat to their power in Europe. Furthermore, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and other European states feared that the union of the crowns of France and Spain would lead to absolute control over the continent. But what hidden motivations guided these actors in their pursuit of hegemony? With the death of Charles II, the bloom of war began to sprout in Europe. In 1701, tensions escalated as European powers formed alliances to counter the rise of Philip V. The Grand Alliance was created, uniting England, the Netherlands, and Austria in an effort to prevent the Spanish crown from consolidating under a French monarch. In this delicate power play, each nation sought to secure its own interests, while the echo of war began to resonate across the lands of Europe. The first confrontations took place on the Iberian Peninsula, where the forces of Philip V faced the armies of the Grand Alliance. As the battle lines were drawn, the war spread beyond the borders of Spain. In 1704, the capture of Gibraltar became a crucial point, marking the strategic importance of the enclave in the Mediterranean. The British forces, allied with the Austrians, managed to seize the stronghold, securing a vital foothold for operations at sea. As the war progressed, the regions of Spain became divided between the supporters of Philip V, known as the Bourbonists, and those who supported his rival, Archduke Charles of Austria, who proclaimed himself as Charles III of Spain. This dynastic conflict not only pitted armies against each other on the battlefield, but also fragmented Spanish society into loyalists and opponents, leaving a trail of distrust and division. Military campaigns followed at a frantic pace. The Battle of Almanza in 1707 would be a decisive turning point. The Bourbon forces, under the command of the Duke of Berwick, defeated the troops of the Grand Alliance. This triumph not only consolidated Philip V's power in Spain, but also led to the loss of territories in the Iberian Peninsula for the Allies. However, the war was not limited to battles. The atrocities committed in the territories affected by the conflict left indelible scars on the civilian population. The immediate consequences of the War of Spanish Succession were profound. The conflict not only resulted in the consolidation of Bourbon power in Spain, but also reconfigured the political map of Europe. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which ended the war, not only recognized Philip V as king, but also involved the cession of important territories. Spain lost control of the Netherlands, Sicily, and Sardinia, in addition to Gibraltar, which became a British stronghold. But at what cost was this apparent stability achieved? The wounds inflicted by the war would not heal easily, leaving a legacy of resentment and distrust that would endure in the collective memory. The enigma left by the War of Spanish Succession lies in the decisions made at that time. Was it truly inevitable that the death of a king would trigger a war of such magnitude? What secrets and hidden ambitions intertwined in the halls of European courts? The quest for power and control, a chess game in which the pieces were moved forcefully, leads us to reflect on the fragility of alliances and the price of power. As the Iberian Peninsula emerged from the shadows of conflict, attention would turn to the need for reforms. The arrival of the Bourbons to the throne would signify not only a dynastic change, but also the beginning of a modernization process that would attempt to revitalize an empire in crisis. The history of the Spanish Empire would continue, but the scars of war would remain as a reminder of the price paid for ambition. The next stage, marked by Bourbon Reformism, would open a new chapter in the search for renewal and stability. Could these reforms be the salvation that a dying empire so desperately needed? The answer, as always in history, is a mystery that still awaits revelation. The resolution of that war would soon give way to a new order in the vast territory of the Spanish Empire. By the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th, Spain found itself trapped in the shadows of a decaying legacy. The Hispanic monarchy, under the leadership of the last Habsburgs, faced a landscape of political and economic instability. War, corruption, and the lack of reforms had weakened the foundations of an empire that once spanned oceans and continents. In this context, the arrival of the Bourbon dynasty would mark a crucial turning point. The ascent of Philip V to the throne in 2000 was a result of the War of Spanish Succession and represented the arrival of a new approach to governance. It was a time when the echo of the Enlightenment began to resonate in Europe, offering new ideas about power, administration, and economy. Philip V, influenced by the reformist currents of his time, set out to modernize the empire. Thus, Bourbon reformism would become a bold attempt to revive the glory of Spain. The administrative and economic reforms driven by the Bourbons extended from the peninsula to the American colonies. The first significant action was the creation of a more efficient administrative system, which sought to break with the corruption and clientelism that had characterized the previous administration. New institutions were established, such as the intendants, officials responsible for overseeing tax collection and resource management. This change, although seen as an advance, also awakened resentment among local elites who feared losing their power. In this new order, figures such as the Count of Florida Blanca and the Marquis of La Ensenada played a fundamental role. Florida Blanca, a skilled politician, emerged as a fervent advocate of the reforms. With a clear vision, he sought to modernize the economy by promoting industry and commerce. The creation of new trade routes and the improvement of infrastructure became his priorities. But was it really enough to reverse the decline of such a vast empire? The decisions made by the Bourbons were not limited to the peninsula. The colonial economy was also affected by these reforms. Efforts were made to encourage trade between the colonies and the metropolis, as well as to reduce the restrictions that had limited economic activity. The introduction of new laws such as free navigation on rivers and the elimination of monopolies aimed to stimulate economic development. However, the implementation of these reforms revealed notable resistance in the colonial realm. The Creole elite, who had thrived under the old regime, faced new competition and changes that threatened their status. Bourbon reformism, despite its intentions of modernization, also left a trail of tension and conflict. The fiscal reforms, which sought to increase the kingdom's revenues, resulted in widespread discontent among the colonists. The new tax demands provoked uprisings and protests that challenged Bourbon authority. In this context, the question arises, was modernization truly a path to prosperity, or merely a prelude to insurrection? The shadow of the Bourbons loomed over an empire struggling to find its place in a changing world. The reforms, although driven by the intention to revitalize, generated a climate of distrust that reverberated in the relationship between the metropolis and the colonies. The decisions made in the peninsula began to have consequences in the vast American lands, where distance and discontent combined to create fertile ground for future revolts. The enigma of Bourbon reformism lies in the paradox between modernization and resistance. The reforms, which were presented as a path to regeneration, revealed deep tensions that threatened the cohesion of the empire. How was it possible that an attempt to revitalize Spanish power led to greater fragmentation? The answer lies in the complex dynamics of power, in the struggle between the metropolis and its colonies, and in the ambitions of those who saw modernization as an opportunity to challenge the established order. As the reforms unfolded, the echo of the Enlightenment began to resonate more strongly in the Spanish environment. The ideas of liberty, equality, and individual rights began to take root in the consciousness of the Creoles, who found themselves trapped in a system that, although attempting to modernize, still clung to old practices. The inherent contradictions of Bourbon reformism became more evident, leaving a trail of unanswered questions. Thus, we find ourselves at a crossroads in history. The Bourbon reforms, although intended to transform and revitalize, also sowed the seeds of discord. In the coming decades, the accumulated tensions would translate into independence movements that would question the very existence of the empire. Was Spain truly prepared for the changes that lay ahead, or was it trapped in a cycle of reforms that would only lead to its own decline? The journey of this transformation would not stop at the peninsula. The reforms that emerged from the minds of the Bourbons would extend to the American colonies, where opposition would intensify. In the next chapter, we will explore how these reforms were implemented in America and what their effects were on colonial administration, unraveling the impact they had on the quest for independence of the Latin American peoples. That wave of changes would soon be addressed by a series of reforms that would transform the face of the American colonies. By the middle of the 18th century, the Spanish Empire was in a state of growing discontent and disorganization in its vast possessions in America. The arrival of the Bourbons to the Spanish throne following the War of Spanish Succession brought with it a new vision, the Bourbon monarchs seeking to consolidate and modernize imperial administration, devised a set of reforms that promised to revolutionize the relationship between the metropolis and its American territories. The historical context of these changes was complex. The colonies, rich in resources but poorly administered, faced problems of corruption, inefficiency, and a growing discontent among the Creoles, those descendants of Spaniards born in America. Colonial administration was seen as a labyrinth of privileges for a few and marginalization for many. In this environment, the figure of the new king, Philip V, and his successors became a symbol of the hope for renewal. Among the key figures in this process was José de Galvez, the Visitor General of New Spain. A fervent advocate of the Bourbon Reforms, Galvez, with his modernizing vision, set out to implement structural changes that encompassed everything from the economy to public administration. The decisions he made were decisive. The creation of new viceroyalties, the reorganization of the audiences, and the promotion of a more efficient tax system. But what led these men to believe they could transform such a vast and diverse empire? The development of events during this period was meteoric. In 1754, Galvez embarked on his journey to New Spain, where he initiated a series of inspections that revealed the critical state of colonial administration. Reforms were introduced that sought to centralize power and weaken the influence of local elites. In 1776, the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata was created, a measure intended to strengthen Spanish control over this strategic region. These reforms, however, were not received with universal enthusiasm. The Creoles, who aspired to greater participation in government, began to question the control of the peninsula and to demand deeper reforms. The immediate consequences of these reforms were palpable. On one hand, there was a greater collection of taxes and a more effective control of colonial administration. New industries were promoted and domestic trade was encouraged. However, discontent also increased. The centralization of power provoked tensions between the Creoles and the Peninsulares, who held the highest positions in administration. Was there really an intention to improve the situation of the colonies? Or was this effort simply an attempt to maintain control over a declining empire? The enigma that remains after these reforms is deeply unsettling. Despite the efforts to modernize the empire, the independent sentiment began to take shape in the colonies. The question persists. Were the Bourbon reforms a temporary solution to a chronic problem, or did they sow the seeds of revolution? The echo of these decisions would resonate in the following decades, as the American colonies began to seek their own destiny. Thus, while the Bourbon reforms attempted to restore order and loyalty, a new thought began to flourish, fueled by the Enlightenment and the desire for freedom. On the horizon, a struggle for independence loomed that would forever change the political map of the continent. As the echo of the reforms faded, the next chapter of our history will take us to explore the influence of Enlightenment thought in Spain and how this new awakening would affect politics and society in the 18th century. Those reforms would soon give way to a new era in the Iberian Peninsula, a breath of thought that would transform the political and social structures of the Spanish Empire. The Enlightenment, that vast intellectual movement sweeping across Europe in the 18th century, would begin to leave its mark on the Spain of the time, challenging ancient traditions and proposing a future in which reason and knowledge would rise as new beacons of hope. In this context, the influence of Enlightenment thought would not only be felt in the salons of the elites, but would also resonate in the hearts of those yearning for change in the oppressive structure of power. The political and social atmosphere that preceded the Enlightenment in Spain was a complex web of tensions. The Habsburg dynasty, weakened by the crisis of the 17th century, had left a legacy of instability. The War of Spanish Succession, which culminated in 2014, had reconfigured the political map of the country, paving the way for the Bourbon reign and the establishment of a renewed absolutism. Under Philip V, the first Bourbon king, attempts were made to centralize power and modernize administration, but the shadows of corruption and inequality remained present. It was in this context of change and latent hope that the Enlightenment would begin to germinate, like a seed in the arid soil of tradition. Among the key figures of this period stand out individuals such as Benito Jerónimo Feijoo, a Benedictine monk who became a beacon of reason and critical thought. Feijoo, through his erudite letters and universal critical theatre, questioned popular beliefs and defended the importance of reason as a guide to knowledge. His ideas, although initially considered subversive, began to resonate among the intellectual elites and the more educated sectors of society. Another fundamental figure was the Count of Campomanes, a politician and economist who promoted reforms in the economy and education, advocating for the need for a more modern and efficient state. Campomanes, like other Enlightenment thinkers, believed that the development of the country depended on education and the improvement of social welfare. The development of these events was marked by a vibrant exchange of ideas that crossed borders. Translations of works by philosophers such as Voltaire and Rousseau began to circulate among the aristocracy and the emerging bourgeoisie, creating a fertile ground for critical thought. The first cafes and societies of Friends of the Country became spaces where these new ideas were debated, where the echo of reason began to displace the silence of dogma. In this spirit, institutions such as the Royal Academy of Fine Arts of San Fernando in 1752 and the Royal Academy of Sciences in 1743 were founded, promoting the study and dissemination of knowledge. The immediate consequences of the Enlightenment in Spain were profound and multifaceted. An openness to science and education emerged that began to challenge traditional structures. The influence of Enlightenment ideas was felt in politics, where movements began to take shape that questioned the legitimacy of absolutism. The first voices in favor of individual rights and equality before the law emerged from this intellectual environment. However, conservative forces, fearful of losing their power, also began to mobilize in response to this new order of ideas. But what was the true impact of the Enlightenment in a nation that, although desiring change, remained tied to its traditions? Were its ideas truly capable of transforming a society rooted in absolutism and Catholicism? The Enlightenment in Spain raises questions that still resonate in history. The mystery of how a movement of thought could have changed the fate of a nation intertwines with the story of an empire that, as it entered its twilight, desperately sought a new identity. As the echo of Enlightenment ideas began to resonate in the salons of the elites, the Spanish Empire faced an even greater challenge. The American colonies were beginning to awaken. Soon, the independence movements in Latin America would ignite like bonfires of resistance against the imperial yoke, and the ideas of freedom and self-determination that emerged from the Enlightenment would become the battle cry of those longing to break the chains. Thus, the next chapter will take us to explore the struggles for independence that would mark the twilight of the empire on the continent, leaving behind a legacy of promises and contradictions. The dissemination of ideas would soon transform into a torrent of insurrection and desire for freedom. As the echoes of the French Revolution resonated around the world, the American colonies of the Spanish Empire began to awaken from their long slumber. The 19th century presented itself as a turning point, a crucible in which new destinies would be forged and old loyalties would fade away. The independence of the American colonies was not merely a cry for freedom. It was the manifestation of a deep yearning, an echo of the ideals of justice and autonomy that had spread across Europe and now, like dancing shadows, loomed over the vast American territory. The political and social context that preceded these independence movements was steeped in tensions and contradictions. For centuries, the viceroyalties had been administered with an iron fist from the peninsula, where Spanish monarchs such as Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII attempted to maintain absolute control over the vast and heterogeneous American lands. However, the Bourbon Reforms, driven throughout the 18th century, had sown discontent while creating a more educated and rights-conscious Creole class. What future could the Creoles, children of Spaniards born in America, expect when they were constantly relegated to a secondary position compared to the Peninsulares, those who arrived from Spain and held the highest positions? In this climate of discontent, figures emerged who would chart the course of the continent. One of the most emblematic characters was Simon Bolivar, known as the Liberator. Born in Caracas in 1783, Bolivar became the beacon of hope for millions. His vision of a united and free America resonated strongly in a continent yearning to break free from the chains of colonialism. Alongside him, figures such as José de San Martín in the south and Miguel Hidalgo in Mexico embodied the rebellious spirit that would begin to challenge the established order. The decision of these leaders to raise their voices against oppression was not coincidental. It was the result of a collective fervor that grew like a hurricane. Beginning in 1808, the winds of change began to blow more forcefully. The Napoleonic invasion of Spain, which led to the capture of Ferdinand VII, created a power vacuum in the colonies. The governing boards formed in various regions began to question the legitimacy of imperial authority. On the 16th of September in 1810 in Dolores, Hidalgo delivered the famous Cry of Dolores, a call to insurrection that would ignite the flame of independence in Mexico. But was this truly the beginning of the revolution, or merely the echo of discontent that had been brewing for years? As the years progressed, the declarations of independence multiplied like a domino effect. In 1811, Venezuela declared itself independent, followed by Colombia and Ecuador. The path to freedom, however, was not straightforward. The battles were bloody, and the sacrifice of thousands of men and women marked the history of each nation fighting for its autonomy. In the Battle of Ayacucho in 1824, Bolivar's army achieved a decisive victory against the royalist forces, sealing the fate of Peru and, to a large extent, of the continent. The struggle, however, was far from over, and the shadow of fragmentation began to loom over the new nations. The immediate consequences of these events were profound. The fall of Spanish control brought not only the creation of new republics, but also a power vacuum that would open the door to internal conflicts. The idea of freedom, so idealized, clashed with the realities of a deeply divided society. Internal struggles, caudillos, and regional rivalries began to define the new order. The new governments faced the difficult task of building nations from the ruins of the empire, leaving questions about the true nature of freedom hanging in the air. Would it be possible to build a future in unity, or would the echo of oppression resurface in new forms? The enigma of this chapter lies in the duality of independence. A victory over colonial control that, however, did not guarantee peace or stability. Emancipation was only the first step on a long road toward the consolidation of identity and sovereignty. What secrets still awaited in the depths of this historical process? The answers lie in the very fabric of the nascent nations, where the ideals of freedom intertwine with the realities of power. In the next chapter, history will take us to the heart of the Iberian Peninsula, where the Spanish War of Independence would erupt in a context of invasion and resistance. The struggle for autonomy would not only be fought in America, but also on Spanish soil itself, leaving an indelible mark on the destiny of both regions. How did these two paths intertwine, and what legacy did they leave for future generations? The search for answers begins. The crisis in the colonies would soon trigger a conflict that would transform the fate of the Iberian Peninsula. The Napoleonic invasion of 1808 marked the beginning of a dark and tumultuous chapter in the history of Spain, known as the Spanish War of Independence. In this context of unease and struggle for sovereignty, not only the foundations of a new political order would be forged, but also the roots of a nationalist sentiment that would resonate through the centuries. The echo of Napoleon Bonaparte's expansionist ambitions resonated throughout Europe. In his quest to consolidate French power, Napoleon had instigated a series of conflicts that disrupted the political balances on the continent. In Spain, the social climate was already tumultuous, marked by tensions between the enlightened elites and the monarchical absolutism of Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII. The corruption and inefficiency of the Bourbon administration fueled popular discontent. Thus, when French troops crossed the Pyrenees in 1808, resistance quickly emerged as a visceral response to the occupation. The decisions of key figures such as the infant Ferdinand, who had been part of the uprising against his own father, and the Prime Minister Manuel Godoy, became fundamental pieces in this intricate power game. Ferdinand VII, after being forced to abdicate under Napoleon's pressure, became a symbol of the struggle for freedom. But what role would the different sectors of society play in this resistance? The answer lay in the Spanish people, who began to rise up, driven by a spirit of insurrection that overflowed into the streets. The unfolding of events was triggered by the uprising of the 2nd of May in 1808 in Madrid, where armed citizens rose against the French troops. This uprising, although brutally suppressed, became a symbol of Spanish resistance. The spark of insurrection spread rapidly to other regions. In places such as Andalusia, Aragon, and Catalonia, the Spanish began to organize into guerrillas, using irregular fighting tactics to harass the invader. However, the war was not only fought on the battlefield. The first steps towards the creation of a new national identity were taken in the governing boards that were formed in the various provinces. The Supreme Central Board, established in 1808, sought to unify the war effort and claim the legitimacy of Spanish sovereignty in the face of occupation. Amidst this chaos, a patriotic fervour developed that channeled discontent into a struggle that transcended mere territorial defence. It was a fight for freedom and self-determination. The immediate consequences of these events were profound. The war would last for 6 years, exhausting both sides and leaving the civilian population trapped in a whirlwind of violence and suffering. The guerrilla resistance, although effective on many occasions, could not hide the devastating repercussions of the war. The Spanish economy was collapsing, cities were besieged, and the population was decimated. The conflict transformed into a scene of atrocities and revenge, where the brutality of the French troops clashed with the determination of a people fighting for their existence. In this context of suffering and resistance, an enigma arises that endures in collective memory. How was it possible for a small country torn by its own internal conflicts to successfully confront one of the most formidable military powers of the time? The answer to this question lies not only in the tenacity of the guerrillas, but also in the ability of the Spanish to unite around a common cause, challenging the class and regional divisions that had characterized their society. The Spanish War of Independence was not only the echo of an armed struggle, but a process that led to the gestation of Spanish national identity. The victory over the French in 1814, although it did not resolve all the country's problems, left an indelible mark on history. The shadow of Napoleon was fading, but the repercussions of the war would continue to resonate in the political decisions that would follow the restoration of Ferdinand VII. Whose return to the throne would mark a return to old absolutist practices. Thus, as the peninsula recovered from the wounds of war, a new enigma loomed over Spain. Could the country unite and move towards modernity? Or would it remain trapped in the shadows of its imperial past? The answer would reveal itself in the years to come, where the Bourbon Restoration would face the challenges of a constantly transforming world. History would continue its course, and with it the search for a new path for the nation. The victory over the invader would soon give way to a new era of uncertainty and tension on the Iberian Peninsula. In 1814, after years of Napoleonic occupation and a conflict that had put the very structure of power in Spain at risk, Ferdinand VII returned to the throne. This event marked the resurgence of absolutism in a country that had glimpsed, albeit briefly, the possibility of a more liberal future. The historical context surrounding the Bourbon Restoration is complex. The French invasion had left deep scars on Spanish society. The Cortes of Cadiz, which had convened in 1810, had enacted the first Spanish constitution in 1812, a document that proclaimed principles of national sovereignty and individual rights. However, the return of Ferdinand VII brought with it the promise of a return to the old times, a shadow looming over the ideals of freedom and progress that had begun to germinate. Spanish society, divided between liberals and absolutists, was preparing for a new confrontation, a tug-of-war between the old regime and the aspirations of a people beginning to awaken. Ferdinand VII, known as the Desired, had been seen by many as the saviour who would restore the lost order. However, his arrival was not merely the return of a monarch, it was the beginning of a chain of decisions that would seal the fate of Spain. Following his proclamation, the king quickly dismantled the liberal reforms established by the Cortes, dissolving the Constitution of 1812 and re-establishing absolutism in its purest form. This return to absolutism not only affected politics but also had profound consequences on the daily lives of Spaniards who found themselves caught in a struggle for their rights and freedoms. At the centre of this plot are key figures who would influence the course of events. Ferdinand VII, with his authoritarian character and desire to regain total control, became the symbol of resistance to change. However, he was not alone in his endeavour. The absolutist forces, supported by an aristocracy fearful of losing their privileges, united to consolidate a regime that in many aspects seemed an echo of the past. On the other hand, the liberals, who had tasted freedom, began to organize themselves into a determined opposition. The figure of Manuel de Godoy, the prime minister during part of the French occupation, became a point of controversy, symbolizing corruption and lack of direction in the government. Events unfolded rapidly. The first action of Ferdinand VII was the repression of the liberals. In 1814, the king ordered the execution of many of those who had defended the Constitution of Cadiz, while others were imprisoned or exiled. This initial repression sowed fear among the ranks of the liberals, but it also ignited a spark of resistance that would manifest in uprisings throughout the country. In 1820, a group of army officers led by Rafael de Riego would rise in arms, proclaiming once again the Constitution of 1812. This uprising, known as the Liberal Triennium, led Ferdinand VII into a period of instability that, although brief, reaffirmed the struggle between absolutism and liberalism. The immediate consequences of these events were significant. The restoration of absolutism created an atmosphere of polarization and conflict that affected the entire nation. Violence and repression became constants in a country that struggled to find peace. The opposition organized itself into secret societies such as the Exalted Liberals, who fought for radical change. In a context where the ideas of freedom and human rights began to circulate, the shadow of absolutism grew darker, fueling resentment and discontent among different sectors of the population. But the enigma that emerges from this restoration is profound. Was the return of Ferdinand VII truly the end of a dark chapter, or the beginning of a struggle that had yet to reach its climax? The question that lingers in the air is whether the history of Spain was doomed to repeat itself. Trapped in an endless cycle of absolutism and liberalism, where each attempt at progress was thwarted by the weight of a past that refused to be forgotten. Thus, the Bourbon Restoration not only marked the return of a king, but also left a legacy of uncertainty and conflict that would continue to resonate in the history of Spain. The struggle for the future of the country was far from over, and the echo of the revolutions to come began to be heard. As the peninsula entered the second half of the 19th century, the shadow of the Restoration would continue to loom, leading the nation toward a destiny marked by the loss of its last colonies and the search for an identity that, after centuries of imperial glory, seemed elusive. The next chapter will reveal how the loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines after the war with the United States forever transformed the essence of the Spanish Empire and the repercussions of this outcome on national identity. That internal instability would soon turn into a collapse that would resonate across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. By the end of the 19th century, the Spanish Empire, which once stretched from the vast territories of America to the islands of Asia, was on the brink of its collapse. The shadow of war loomed over its last colonies like an echo of past times when the Hispanic monarchy ruled the seas. This chapter delves into the enigma of the loss of Cuba. Puerto Rico and the Philippines, a tragedy that marked the end of an era and left a profound mark on history. Historical context. The 19th century witnessed a radical transformation in the global landscape. The ideas of independence and nationalism began to flourish in the colonies, challenging the old paradigms of imperial control. In America, the echoes of the French Revolution and the struggles for independence of the Spanish colonies had sown the seed of insurrection. Meanwhile, in Europe, the Spanish-American War of 1998 was brewing in a climate of tension and imperial ambition, where the power of the United States was consolidating as a new actor on the global stage. The Spanish economy, weakened by decades of internal conflicts, faced challenges that led it to bankruptcy. The loss of the American colonies had drastically reduced the sources of wealth that once flowed to the peninsula. And the Bourbon Reforms, while attempting to modernize colonial administration, failed to halt the inevitable decline. In this context, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines became the last vestiges of a crumbling empire. Key figures and decisions. At the center of this drama are figures who, through their decisions, would play a crucial role in the fate of the empire. On one side, the American president William McKinley, who was under pressure from public opinion demanding intervention in Cuba, where the struggle for independence was intensifying. The brutal repression of the Spanish regime on the island, along with the explosion of the American battleship Maine in the port of Havana in 1998, became the catalyst that would ignite the conflict. The Spanish general Ramon Blanco, governor of Cuba, attempted to implement policies that would ease tensions, but his moderate approach failed to curb the rise of insurrection. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the revolutionary leader Emilio Aguinaldo emerged as a symbol of the struggle for independence, challenging Spanish colonial authority and seeking support from the United States. The destinies of these figures would intertwine in unexpected ways, revealing the complexities of the war that was looming. Development of events. On the 25th of April in 1998, the United States declared war on Spain, marking the beginning of a conflict that would unfold on multiple fronts. The war in Cuba was swift and decisive. In a period of only 3 months, American forces, supported by Cuban revolutionaries, managed to wrest control of the island from Spain. The Battle of San Juan Hill, where Colonel Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders became heroes, symbolized the bold American intervention. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey's fleet headed towards Manila, where the naval battle on the 1st of May in 1998 resulted in a crushing victory for the United States. The chaotic surrender of Spanish forces in the Philippines marked an irreversible turn in the fate of the colony. The imminent defeat left the Hispanic monarchy facing an abyss from which it could not return. As the war progressed, the future of the conquered areas began to take shape. The Treaty of Paris, signed on the 10th of December in 1998, formalized the loss of the last colonies, Cuba, which became an American protectorate, Puerto Rico annexed, and the Philippines ceded to the United States for $20 million. The echo of this decision would resonate throughout the 20th century, forever altering the relationship between Spain and its former possessions. Immediate consequences. The outcome of the war marked a turning point in the history not only of Spain but also of Latin America and Asia. The loss of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines left a deep wound in Spanish national pride. The political repercussions were immediate. The government of Sagasta, which had dealt with the consequences of the war, found itself unable to manage social and political discontent. A sense of humiliation took hold of the nation, and many Spaniards began to question the imperial model that had defined their identity for centuries. In Cuba, the new American order brought with it the promise of modernization, but also deep resentment among Cubans who had fought for their independence. Puerto Rico, although under American control, became a laboratory for colonial policies, experimenting with reforms that are still debated today. The Philippines, for their part, plunged into an even more complex conflict, where the struggle for independence transformed into an insurgency against the new colonizer. The enigma of the chapter. As the dust of war settled, a question arose in the minds of many. Was it truly the end of an empire, or simply a change of owner in a larger power game? The legacy of the loss of these colonies persists to this day, leaving a shadow of questions about the identity and future of the peoples that were once part of the vast Spanish Empire. What secrets still awaited in the depths of these lands, and how would they shape the destiny of their inhabitants in the 20th century? The history of the Spanish Empire, marked by glory and decline, enters a new chapter where modernization and the search for a new national identity become the backdrop of a country trying to overcome its imperial past. As we begin to unravel the transition to modernity, new questions emerge about the legacy left by the empire in the collective memory. How will history be rewritten in a world rapidly advancing towards the future? That loss would soon give way to a period of radical transformation. As the 20th century unfolded, Spain found itself at a crossroads. The echoes of a declining empire resonated in the streets of Madrid and Barcelona. While the nation faced the shadows of its imperial past, modernization became an imperative, a path toward a new identity that left behind the weight of centuries of rule and glory. The historical context of this transition is fundamental to understanding the journey toward modernity. By the end of the 19th century, Spain had lost much of its global influence. The wars of independence in Latin America, the war with the United States, and the loss of the last colonies in 1998 had left the country in a state of introspection and disillusionment. The so-called disaster of '98 was not only a territorial crisis, but also a profound crisis of identity. How could a nation that once ruled vast territories in the New World reinvent itself in a changing European and global context? In the face of this dilemma, leaders such as Francisco Silvelar and José Canalejas emerged, advocating for political and social reforms. Their vision was clear: Spain needed to modernize its political and economic structure to regain its place in the world. The period of restoration, which had established a bipartisan political system, would soon prove incapable of addressing the challenges of a transforming society. Corruption and clientelism became shadows haunting a political system that promised stability but, in reality, led to stagnation. The arrival of the 20th century brought with it an air of change. Industrialization began to gain momentum, particularly in regions such as Catalonia and the Basque Country, where textile production and steelmaking flourished. This economic development not only attracted workers from rural areas but also fostered the creation of a new urban proletariat that clamored for labor rights and improvements in their living conditions. The Industrial Revolution in Spain, although late compared to other European nations, began to give rise to a new social order. However, the process of modernization was not linear nor free of tensions. The struggle between traditionalism and progress intensified. In this context, figures such as the intellectual José Ortega y Gasset began to question national identity. What did it mean to be Spanish in a world moving toward modernity? Ortega raised the need for a regeneration that transcended old structures and envisioned a future more in line with the times. The development of events during this transition period was marked by social and political unrest. The tragic week of 1909 in Barcelona, a workers' uprising that arose in response to the mobilization of reservists for the war in Morocco, highlighted the growing rift between the elites and the working classes. This conflict not only reflected internal tensions but also exposed the inability of the Restoration government to manage social discontent. How many more times would the Spanish people rise against a system that seemed to ignore their needs? The First World War, although Spain remained officially neutral, had profound repercussions on the economy and politics of the country. The war allowed the Spanish industry to thrive, but it also left a legacy of inflation and inequality that would extend throughout the decade of the 1920s. During this period, political movements such as socialism and anarchism began to gain followers, as well as Catalan nationalism, which demanded greater rights and autonomy. Each of these movements represented an echo of the old struggles for identity, now within a modern framework that demanded recognition and voice. The key decisions of this era were largely driven by a political elite overwhelmed by the emerging social reality. The dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, starting in 1923, attempted to silence these movements under an authoritarian regime, but its effort to stabilize the country resulted in new discontent. Political repression only intensified the demand for change among the population. The proclamation of the Second Republic in 1931 was an attempt to restore confidence in a democratic system. But internal divisions and a lack of consensus among various political sectors led the country down a path of polarization. The immediate consequences of these events were profound. The Second Republic, despite its intentions to modernize and democratize Spain, found a fractured nation where the struggle between left and right ideals intensified. The civil war that broke out in 1936 was not only an armed conflict but also a battle for the future of the nation. The struggle between the Republicans and the Franquistas would not only define the political destiny of the country but also mark a deep rupture in the Spanish collective consciousness. The enigma of this chapter lies in this search for identity and modernity. In a country struggling to free itself from the chains of its imperial past, how could old traditions coexist with new aspirations? Could Spain find a balance between its rich cultural heritage and the need for a more inclusive and progressive future? These questions, still resonant in contemporary society, invite us to reflect on the true meaning of modernity in a context marked by the shadows of its history. As we delve into the next chapter, it is essential to consider how the decisions made during these turbulent decades would shape the legacy of the Spanish Empire. The transition to modernity was not only a journey toward progress, but also a path toward understanding the traces that the past has left on the present. What legacy would rise from the ashes of a fallen empire? How would the stories of those who were part of this vast tapestry be rewritten? The answer to these concerns will lead us to the legacy of the Spanish Empire and the way its influence endures in the contemporary world. The echo of a golden age resonates in the shadows of history, whispering secrets and mysteries that still endure. As we close this chapter of our journey through the vast and complex Spanish Empire, we are confronted with the inevitable question: what is the true legacy of this vast rule? An empire that stretched from the lands of America to the islands of the Pacific has left indelible marks on the contemporary world, shaping not only the geopolitical map but also the culture, language, and identity of millions. The historical context that leads us to this reflection begins in a world in transformation. At the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the empire was crumbling, giving way to emerging new nations. The loss of the last colonies in 1898 was a devastating blow, not only for Spain at that time, but also for the very understanding of the empire. The shadows of its former possessions rose like ghosts, reminding us of a past of splendor and conquest. This period of crisis gave rise to the need to redefine national identity and to reconcile with a legacy that, at its core, was both a symbol of greatness and of oppression. Among the key figures of this transition are individuals such as the philosopher José Ortega y Gasset and the writer Miguel de Unamuno, who opened the debate on Spanish identity in an already globalized world. How can one reconcile the heritage of an empire that had brought the language and the Catholic faith to remote corners of the planet with the injustices committed during its expansion? These questions become enigmas that challenge subsequent generations, marking the path toward a new understanding of history. The development of these events took place in a context of modernization and the search for identity. The influence of Enlightenment thought had sown the seeds of criticism and historical revision, paving the way for a profound reflection on the past. The voices calling for a revision of the history of the empire began to gain strength. In this sense, the work of authors such as the Spanish novelist and essayist Ramón María del Valle Inclán became a mirror reflecting the contradictions of a country still struggling to find its place in the world. The immediate consequences of this process were palpable. The Spanish language, one of the most spoken in the world, is perhaps the most evident legacy of the empire, from the Mexico of Cortés to the lands of Argentina. Spanish took root in diverse cultures, evolving and adapting, but always preserving a common thread that unites millions of speakers today. However, is this a one-dimensional legacy? The influence of Spanish culture in Latin America is accompanied by a myriad of nuances. From the fusion of indigenous traditions with European culture to the emergence of literary and artistic movements that challenge traditional narratives, the enigma of the chapter looms over us. What secrets still lie in the depths of this shared history? Is the legacy of the Spanish Empire a song of triumph, a lament of oppression, or a mixture of both? The answers are not simple. History is composed of multiple layers, and each one invites reflection and analysis. In the political and social realm, the influence of the empire has manifested in the shaping of modern nations. The borders drawn during the colonial era have left a legacy of tensions and conflicts that still resonate in the present. The struggle for self-determination and national identity in many of these countries reveals the deep scars left by colonization. Can we truly understand the modern history of Latin America without considering the impact of Spanish rule? As nations strive to build their identity, the echo of the past remains an influential factor. The cultural legacy is also undeniable. From music to gastronomy, through festivities, the influence of Spanish culture intertwines with local traditions, creating a rich mosaic that reflects the complexity of Latin American identity. Festivities such as the Day of the Dead in Mexico or Holy Week in various Spanish-speaking countries bear witness to a fusion of indigenous and Catholic beliefs that have shaped contemporary culture. But to what extent can this legacy be celebrated without acknowledging the history of suffering that accompanies it? Through the centuries, the Spanish Empire has also left its mark in the realm of literature and art. Authors such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Jorge Luis Borges have taken the roots of the Spanish language to new heights, exploring themes of identity, memory, and reality. This dialogue with the past is, in itself, a form of reclamation of what it means to be an heir to an empire that, although marked by conquest and oppression, has also given rise to a rich and vibrant cultural production. As we conclude this journey through the legacy of the Spanish Empire, we face one last question. Can we truly rid ourselves of the shadows that pursue us, or are we doomed to live in their wake? The answer may never be definitive. History, like time, is a constantly changing river, and the waters of its legacy flow through our lives, shaping our identity in ways we often do not fully understand. Thus, as we close this chapter, we find ourselves not only with a legacy of conquest and expansion, but also with a profound and multifaceted enigma that continues to challenge our understanding of the past. The traces of the Spanish Empire are more than mere marks on a map. They are the echoes of a time that, although distant, continues to resonate in contemporary reality. Ultimately, the true mystery lies in how we choose to remember, interpret, and live with this legacy in the present. Will we be able to learn from the lessons of the past, or will we remain trapped in the cycles of repetition that history often imposes upon us? Only time will tell, but what is clear is that the echo of the Spanish Empire will never completely fade away. Instead, it will remain an inseparable part of the human narrative.